Hey, it's Jake, and in this video, I'm going to show you some of my favorite features of working inside of Illustrator, specifically for motion design. Illustrator is one of those tools that I feel like a lot of motion designers dread opening up. They really don't want to get in there because the interface is different than After Effects, the tools behave differently, and you can get frustrated pretty quickly if you don't know what you're doing. And I really wish it wasn't that way, because Illustrator is one of my favorite programs, and you can really do a lot inside of it much easier than if you were making stuff right in After Effects. So I'm gonna walk you through making some artwork in a way that you probably haven't thought of doing before, and then bring it into After Effects and make a really quick animation. So by the end of this video, hopefully Illustrator will be your new best friend. Let's jump in. Now, what I have here is some artwork that's halfway there. It's not complete yet, but I have an old Nintendo Entertainment System, original Nintendo cartridge, complete with the dust cover. So I'm going to jump over to my layers panel right here. If your layers panel isn't open, just come up to window, down to layers, and that will open up. And I have this first object, a group of that dust cover. So I move that off and we can see what's behind it. Here's our cartridge and it's incomplete. This is what we're gonna do. I'm gonna finish completing this artwork. And if you wanna follow along with me, you can go ahead and download the source project files for this video, where you'll have both this state of the artwork as well as the final project files once everything is completed. But here we go. This is where I'm gonna start. But before I go any further, I wanna point out that I have my properties panel open, and I suggest that you have that open as well. So come up to window and go down to properties. This is just a really nice panel that basically brings up the most commonly used options for whatever you have selected. So as I grab certain things, it's going to update based on what my selection is and give me controls without having to dig through a lot of panels. So go ahead and open that up. Let's go ahead and get started with this section right here and add in some more details. If you're not familiar with the design of an NES cartridge, there are basically some sections in here. This is kind of like a little trench that has some dividing rectangles inside here. So I want to add in some lines. And you might think to, grab the rectangle tool and then drag a rectangle out, and then I could make this, the same width exactly, and then grab my eyedropper tool, eye on the keyboard, and then sample the other line so that it matches the style. And then I would have to maybe duplicate this, and I'm using my smart guides. That's what these pink highlights showing up are. If you go up to View, Smart Guides, Command U is the shortcut. That's very helpful for snapping things to each other. But I could continue doing this, holding Option, clicking and dragging on an object to duplicate it all the way down. But there's another method that I think is a little bit quicker and more flexible. One thing that you're going to hear me say a lot in this video is that this is one way of doing things, and that's something that I actually like about Adobe software, is there's tons of ways to do any given task. And the right way might be different for you than it is for me, and it might be different depending on the project. So in this case, what I'm going to do is switch to my line tool. That's right here. And because I had already sampled that shape with my eyedropper tool, it loaded up the same style. So I have this purple stroke, which is what I want. I don't have to worry about that. And it even brought over the point size of 10 points. So I can go ahead and just click, hold Shift and drag and let go. And there I've got my first line. Now I want to kind of position this so that it's making that first section about the size of the rectangle that I want. Then I'm going to hold down Option, hover over it, get those two arrows, click and drag to duplicate. And I'll hold down Shift just for good measure to make sure it goes only on that vertical axis, and then bring it all the way down to where I want the last section of the rectangle to be, so somewhere around here. Now basically what I want is even rectangles that are all about this same size between here, and then this last section is a little bit bigger, which is how the original NES cartridge was. All of the rectangles were uniform up until about there. I'm not going to be super precise. You see, I'm not bringing over an actual reference photo and making this perfect, but that's about the distance I want it to cover. Now what I'm going to do is use the blend tool to fill in and repeat that line between these two lines. So if you're not familiar with the blend tool, that lives right over here in your tools panel. I'm going to click on that, and the way it works is by selecting two or more objects with the tool. So I'm going to start by clicking once right up here, and we're looking at that little white square. That's kind of where your mouse pointer will click. I'll click on that first, and then I'll click on the second line, and it fills it in with purple. So what's happening here? Well, it's basically blending those two lines together so that it's a nice, solid, smooth blend. But that's not what I want. So to get to my blend options, I'm now going to double click on the tool, Since this is selected, it's going to affect that blend. Double click that and bring up the blend options. First thing I want to do is make sure that I have preview selected so that I can see the changes that I'm making. And just like I said, the spacing is default to smooth color. So it's just blending everything together. We're not seeing any space between those paths. But if I change this from smooth color to specified steps, this is basically the number of samples that it's going to use to create the blend. So if I just tap my down arrow, you can see that I'm lowering the number of duplicates until I can start to see between those lines and get it about where I want it. So somewhere around there, probably about 10, maybe 11, and I'll click OK. And then to make sure that these gaps are exactly the same as this one right here, all I'm gonna do is grab my direct selection tool, select these 2 points right here, so I'm not adjusting this bottom one, this bottom path, and then click and drag it up until it snaps to that top line. And that way I can know for certain every single one of these gaps is identical. Now the reason why I use my direct selection tool is because if I were to just grab one of these two paths now, you see that it's selecting both of them, and that's because the blend tool creates a group. So I can't edit one of those two paths using my selection tool, and that's just the nature of the blend tool. What's great about this technique is that I can now grab one of these two paths and manipulate it, and it's going to update all of that spacing for me automatically. So if I wasn't happy with the gap here, if I wanted to be a little bit smaller, I just drag it down a little bit and the spacing is 100% perfect. And if I want to adjust that again to maybe add in one more line, I'll just select it, go into my blend tool, click on preview and increase the number of steps one more time, and there we go. I'm happy with that spacing, but I want to pay attention to one tiny little detail right here, which you can't even really see at this point, but it is something that is important to know and can really trip you up inside of Illustrator if you're not aware of it. I'm going to come up to View and switch to my outline view. Command Y is the shortcut for that. And what this is going to do is take off all the styling of my paths so that all I see are the actual paths. And the text layers, those are staying solid because they're text. They're not actual outline paths. But what I want to look at is right here. This is the bottom portion of my blend. And I'm going to zoom in real close between this point and this point. You'll notice this didn't actually snap to that edge, even though I have my smart guides turned on. If I click and drag this and try and move it, you can see that it is not letting me snap it to that path, and it's not letting me go between these points, and it's almost like it's snapping to a grid. Well, that's actually exactly what's happening. It's snapping to a pixel grid. This is a concept you got to understand. Even though Illustrator is a vector program, when you export these graphics, whether it's as a JPEG or a PNG, or you're bringing it into After Effects, ultimately, it's going to be rasterized into pixels. Yes, the source artwork is vector, but it's going to have to be rasterized before you can actually see it. Even when you're looking at it in Illustrator, right now, even though I'm zoomed into 1200%, it's rasterizing it at 1200%. So that's something you really got to get a grasp on. And to fix this problem inside of Illustrator, I'm going to switch back to my outline mode. Command Y on the keyboard was a shortcut. I'm going to come up to this top right corner right here where we have Align Art to Pixel Grid. This is what's preventing me from lining up this point to this line. So I'm going to uncheck that, and then I can grab this anchor point and move it over freely. I'm not too concerned with being pixel perfect on this artwork. If you are, that is an important feature and something that is very helpful for making pixel perfect artwork. But I'm just going to clean this up so it snaps to each edge, and I need to make sure I do it for the top path as well, which, as you can see, isn't aligned at all on any of these edges. So I'm just going to move this one up here and then scroll over, move this one up here. And now I can know that that's perfectly aligned. And I'm going to leave that unchecked so that I don't run into that issue anymore. But speaking of pixel perfect, let's take a look at one other feature that I feel like a lot of motion designers aren't aware of, which is coming up to View and saying Pixel Preview right here. What this does is gives you a rasterized preview of what your artwork will look like once you export it or bring it up in another piece of software. It's no longer presenting this as vector artwork. You can see the pixels. If I zoom in, you can see not only does a pixel grid come up, but you're going to see this aliasing on the edges, and this is going to give you an identical preview of what you will see when you export it. That's very useful for getting an idea of what your artwork is going to look like, and it's especially helpful when you're trying to make that pixel perfect artwork. Again, I'm not worried about it, but it's something to be aware of. I'll turn that back off. We're back to our vector view, and we can move on. Now, this text right here is cool, but I think we can make it a little bit better. I want to add some depth to this, make it look a little bit more 3D, and I also want to just stylize it a little bit, maybe slant it. So one way to do that inside of Illustrator is by coming over to the shear tool, which is underneath the scale tool right here, shear, and then with that selected, I can click and drag to kind of skew this around. And if I hold down Shift, that will help snap so that I can only, distort it on a horizontal or vertical axis or 45 degree angles. But I think I just want to give it a slight angle to kind of match this MoGraph text a little bit. That might be a little bit too much, but that's nice because it's still editable text. But I like that style a little bit better. I think that fits in with that text. It just feels like a more designed block of text that way. And now I want to give it some more depth. And to do this, I'm going to use an effect. So again, I'm going to select that text and take a look at the properties panel. Now this is automatically bringing up the appearance panel, which is what I wanted to actually get to. But because I had properties panel open, it automatically suggests this might be something you want. Then I'm going to come down to this little effects button and choose under my Illustrator effects, distort and transform. Really quickly, I want to point out that Illustrator effects are all vector effects that are manipulating your paths, where the Photoshop effects are all raster effects that are being applied on top of your vectors. They're not modifying the vectors, they're just applying things on top of them. Illustrator effects actually manipulate the paths. So we're going to go into distort and transform and find the transform effect. This will bring up the transform effect panel. And again, I'm going to start by clicking on the preview button so I can see my changes. And this allows me to adjust the scale, move around my object, rotate it, and a bunch of other options. I'm going to use this effect to add some 3D depth to my text. So what I want to do is first increase the number of copies to, say, 10. So this is a lot like the repeater inside of After Effects. So I'm creating 10 copies, but they're not transformed at all. They're all right on top of each other. That's why I'm not seeing anything. But if I just move this a little bit on the horizontal and vertical axis, there you go. You can see this is repeating that object and that transformation over and over again, just like the repeater on shape layers inside of After Effects. So what I want to do is bring that in a lot. Say maybe 6 pixels in each axis. And then I want to scale down the horizontal and vertical a little bit, maybe just 97% on each axis. And then actually, I'm probably going to need to bring this in a lot more, maybe even just 1 pixel, and see what that does. Okay, so I think I want to shift it over to on the horizontal, maybe 2 pixels, and maybe the vertical will do 1.5. And there we go. That's looking pretty good. I'll click OK, and the problem now is that we can't read the text. So what I want to do is bring up the actual appearance panel. And to do that, I'm just going to click on these 3 little dots. That opens up the full appearance panel, and we can take a look at what's going on. In the appearance panel, there our transform effect is showing up, but we can't really see anything else, like the color of the text isn't showing up. That's because there is the actual object, and then there are the characters within that type object. If I double click on characters, that's where we're going to see the stroke and the fill for that text. I want to change the colors of this text so that the fill is actually yellow and the stroke is this magenta color. So to do that, I'm going to click off of this so that I'm not editing that type anymore, switch to my eyedropper tool, and shift click on this yellow color. That's going to apply the color to whichever one of these 2 I have selected, the fill or the stroke. If I would have had the stroke active, it would have applied the yellow to the stroke. And I want that stroke to be magenta, so with that active, I'm going to shift click on this text, and there we go. We've got the stroke around the fill, and that's great, but there's an issue. If I made this stroke any bigger, let's go into the characters, change the stroke up a little bit. My fill has vanished. If we click off of it, we can't see it anymore, and that's because the stroke is over top of the fill. If I go back into those characters again, I'd really like that stroke to appear behind the fill, but that's not something I can do to the characters themselves. But I can do it to the object. So what I want to do now is actually backtrack a little bit and get rid of this stroke and get rid of this fill. So with that selected, I'll click on the cancel button, and get rid of the fill so there's nothing there. This is now just an empty text layer. Those paths are there, but they are not styled. Then I'm going to select the text again. Instead of going into the characters, I'm going to add a fill and a stroke to the actual object rather than the characters. So the stroke, again, I want that to be the magenta color. Shift click with the eyedropper on that. Grab the fill, shift click on the yellow. And now, because this is on the object, not the characters, I can move that fill on top of the stroke. Great, now I can make this as big as I need it to be. So probably around 5 points to fill in all those gaps. And I'm going to make the cap and corner nice and round by clicking on this text right here and choosing round cap and round join. Maybe make that just a little bit bigger, making sure that all of those gaps are gone. And actually, you know what? I could lower that to be whatever stroke width I want. Go back into my transform and then just increase the number of copies. So I'll increase this to maybe 20 and then divide these horizontal and vertical numbers by 2. So 2 would become 1 and 1.5 would become 0.75. And that way there are just more samples scrunched into that same amount of space. I think that looks pretty good. I'm zoomed in really far. If I press Command 1 to zoom to 100%, now you can't see those individual samples at all, but it adds some depth to that text. I like that. I'm just gonna shift it around a little bit so it fits a little bit more nicely within that gap on, between the M and the H, but I think that's gonna work out just great. Okay, next up, we need to add the game's logo, which will live right here. And it is going to be a keyframe. So what I want to do is start making that keyframe. I'm going to lock my background just so I don't accidentally manipulate it by pressing Command 2 with that selected. That will lock whatever you have selected. And we're going to put a keyframe logo right in here, but we got to build it. So what I'm going to do is base this on a square. So I'm going to select that and then drag out a box while holding Shift and make a square. Now this is that same background color. I should probably make that styled the same as the cartridge. So I'll just sample the triangle for that outline and then shift click on that yellow to give me that yellow fill. There we go. Now I need to make this a keyframe, and you might think, just grab the pen tool, grab that object, add in some points and then bring them in a little bit. But I'm actually going to do this in a little bit different way that's a little less destructive. So I'm going to undo until we're back to our normal square. Then I'm going to duplicate this square, move it over by holding Option and Shift, clicking and dragging, and then rotate it 45 degrees. So I'm going to switch to my rotation tool, R on the keyboard, click and drag while holding Shift, snap to that 45 degrees, and then move this over about where I want it to cut out that keyframe. Then I'm going to duplicate it, bring it over here, and I want to make sure that both of these are on equal distance from the center of this square. To do that very quickly, I'm just going to select all 3 objects, and then my Align panel shows up here. If you don't see this panel up here, come up to Window, Control, make sure that's selected. But then we're going to come over to this button right here, Horizontal Distribute Center. And before I click it, I want to make sure that Align to Selection is checked, not to Artboard or Key Object. That way it's going to look at what I have selected. I'll click on this, and it just barely shifted because I was pretty close, but shifted that square over just enough so that it's perfectly centered between these 2 objects. Then I want to select all 3 of these and come over to my Pathfinder, which shows up in my Properties panel, and go over the second one, which is minus front, and then hold down Option and click. And what this does is creates a compound shape. You might have been familiar with the Pathfinder already, but this allows me to use those 2 objects to cut holes into the object behind it. And because I held down Option, I'm able to manipulate this after the fact and preserve that Pathfinder operation. So if I looked at this and said, you know what, I think the square on the inside should be a little bit bigger, I could grab it with my Direct Selection tool, A on the keyboard, switch to my Scale tool, S on the keyboard, click and hold Shift and just make it a little bit bigger. Or maybe I don't want these to actually be at 45-degree angles. I'll select those 2 points. Again, Scale is S on the keyboard, Scale tool, Shift, click and drag that out, and now those aren't quite as dramatic. But this is all non-destructive because I'm using a compound shape rather than just destructively expanding that Pathfinder operation. So I think that's a pretty good looking shape. Now I want to position that about where I want it, so I'm going to grab the center and move it to about the center of this object. I think that looks about good. and I want to scale it down. So I'm going to grab this transform handle, hold down Option and Shift to scale it proportionally from the center, and scale it down about that big, maybe a little bit smaller. Now that seems to have worked, but it caused one issue. If we zoom in here, you'll notice that this stroke width is no longer the same width as the rest of my strokes, and I want that to be consistent. So what happened was, if I deselect everything, I just clicked on my artboard, there's this little option that has Scale Strokes and Effects selected, and that is going to scale down the stroke width as well as the entire object. So now I have 4.989 as the stroke width instead of 10 points. So let me undo that scale operation, uncheck that Scale Strokes and Effects, and then scale this down one more time. And there we go. Now you can see that the object is scaling, the vector paths are scaling, but the stylized stroke is not. It's staying at 10 points, and I can reposition this however I need it to be, and there we go. Perfect. There's also the Scale Corners checkbox. That's something to be aware of. It wasn't applicable to my object, but if I wanted rounded corners, which I think I do, I would select my object, press A to get to my direct selection tool, and then increase my corners radius up here. I'll hold down Shift and click up to give a 10-point radius. I think that's a little bit too much, so maybe back that off to say 5. If I were to scale this up now, the corners are going to scale with it. If I had Scale Corners unchecked, then they will not. That will always stay 5-point roundness no matter what. So be aware of that. It definitely comes in handy and helps you stay less frustrated when you're trying to manipulate things and you're not sure why things are changing or not changing the way that you're expecting them to. All right, I think I want to make this a little bit wider, so I'm going to double click into this object to get into the isolation mode, which allows me to edit just the objects in the group. I can't edit anything else. And then just make it a little bit wider, so it's a little bit more squatty of a keyframe. I think that looks pretty good. Maybe make these two objects a little bit squattier as well. And my object, or my transform box, is at a 45-degree angle. I don't want that. I want it to reset, so I'm going to come up to Object, Transform, Reset Bounding Box, and then click on this handle, hold Option, and squat that down a little. So there we go. We've got a little bit more of a stylized looking eased keyframe. And now I want to stylize it a little bit more. Right now it looks exactly like the background, but it's the logo basically. So I want to make it pop a little bit off of that background. To do this, I'm going to also use the blend tool to make a kind of interesting looking shading effect. So let's start by drawing two lines just like we did with these ones over here. I'll switch to my line tool, which is the backslash on your keyboard. And I'm going to draw the first one in line with the top of that keyframe. Doesn't really matter how wide it is as long as it's going past that keyframe. And then I'm going to duplicate that all the way down to the bottom. Now, this time, instead of keeping both lines the same width, I want to make the top one thicker, maybe not 20 points, maybe around 15, and then the bottom one thinner, so maybe 5 points. Then I want to blend those two together. So I need to be careful with this, but I'll select my blend tool, make sure I click on this object, then on this object, nothing behind it, and it blends them together. I don't need that roundness on the corners, so I'm just going to grab my stroke, turn those back to just being straight caps, and then I want to adjust my blend so that it is again specified steps, and drop it down so that I see gaps between every line, maybe something like that, maybe one less. Click OK. And now I'm going to take this a step further and not only blend the shapes, which you can see that the blend is going from the thick line to the thin line and it's interpolating between there, but it can also do this with colors. So I'm going to grab my direct selection tool and grab this bottom line and make this the magenta color. So with that selected, I'm going to press I on my keyboard, make sure that my stroke is active, hold down Shift and click on that magenta text. And there we go, we've got this nice blend of not only size, but the colors blending from this dark purple to the magenta color. Then I want to take this keyframe object, which I am happy with the shape now, and I want to use it as a container for these lines. So I need to move it above those lines. So I'm going to go to my layers panel, find that compound shape, and drag it above the blend. Now, I don't need the styling of this path anymore, and I don't need the compound shape editability of this anymore either. So I'm going to open up my Pathfinder by going to Window, Pathfinder. and I'm going to apply that operation, the Pathfinder operation, by clicking on expand. And now I have just this vector path with nothing else extra, and I can use it as a clipping mask of these lines. So I'm going to just increase the size a little bit so that the paths cover the entire blend behind that object. And I'm going to just go ahead and get rid of the styling. I don't need to see that at all. I'm just going to make sure that this is about the size of the objects behind it. Shift click on that blend and then make a clipping mask. Now you can come up to Object, Clipping Mask, Make, or the shortcut for that is Command 7. What that's going to do is use the top object as a mask to contain that object behind it within. And now I have this kind of gradient, retro looking blend that is making up the shading of the keyframe, and it's contained within that shape. And from here, I can manipulate this further. If I want this line to be a little bit thinner, I'll just drop it down to maybe 2. There we go. And that's looking pretty cool. But I don't think on its own, it's communicating enough that that's supposed to be a keyframe. So I want to add a stroke, an outline around this shape, but I want to do it in a little bit of a stylized way. So first of all, I'm just going to scale this whole object down just a little bit. And then I want to copy that path, not the blend behind it. So I'm going to double click into this object to get that isolation mode, select that path and copy, and then double click out of it to get back out of isolation mode and press Command Shift V to paste in place. And now I can add some strokes on here. So first of all, I want to make a magenta outline. So I'm going to make sure that my stroke is active, press I on the keyboard to get to my eyedropper and shift click on that magenta color. I'll make that nice and thick, 10 points, and round off the cap and the corner. So there we go, we've got our path, but it is covering up that blend and I don't want it to be touching it at all. I could move it back one step in the layer order by grabbing it and dragging it down once, but then you see the blend overlapping the stroke, and that's not gonna work. Another option would be to select that path again, move that stroke from aligning to the center to the outside, but then it looks like it's just containing that blend, and again, that's not the effect I'm going for. I want to have a yellow gap between this outline and the blend. So I'm going to undo that, and then I'm going to add an effect. This is another one of those Illustrator effects, so I'm going to go to Effects, go to Path, and then Offset Path. Preview one more time, and what this is going to let you do is exactly what it allows you to do inside of After Effects, which is just offset that path from the original. So I want to push this off maybe 10 pixels. I'll change the join to round, so that's nice round corners, and I think that's going to work. Maybe push it off just a little bit more, somewhere around there. Click OK. And then I think everything just needs to scale down a little bit. So I'm going to grab both the blend and the outline. Ooh, this might be a little difficult, so let me actually just grab them here. I'm going to target the clip group, and I'm going to shift target the path, and then scale them both down with the scale tool. S on the keyboard, hold shift to scale proportionately, and there we go. Maybe that outline's a little too thick, so I'm just going to make sure I have that selected, and then decrease that just a little bit, maybe around 6 points. And because I didn't have scale strokes and effects checked, I'm going to need to manipulate this a little bit because that top line right there, that gap is not thick enough for my taste. So I think right about there is going to work a little bit better. The offset now is a little bit larger than I'd like it. So this is just part of working inside of Illustrator, is pushing and pulling things until you're happy with the way that they look. So I'm going to grab that offset paths and just drop it down a few points, maybe around 10. And I think I'm actually just going to stray away from that 10-point thickness a little bit. Grab that path. I'm going to move this up so it's easier to select. Drop that thickness down a little, and then maybe even reduce the corner rounding. So I'm going to select that and then just turn it down to 0. And then from there, just increase it a little bit. Maybe 2 points even is enough. Something like that. But I need to make sure I do that to the actual clipping mask for that blend as well. So I have that selected, and I'll go in to those corners, again, set it to 0, and then increase it just maybe 2 pixels. So there we go. Those are a little less rounded now. That outline is a little thinner. I think this is looking pretty good. Let's look at 100% preview. I like that. I just want to make it a little bit more squatty. So I'm going to adjust this by switching into my outline view, selecting my direct selection tool so that this way I only select the portions of the path that I want to manipulate. Hold down Shift and press the right arrow to move it over just a little. Then I'll grab all of this again and align it to the center of that object. There we go. It snaps to the center. Command Y to get back out of there. And there we go. We've got a nice fat looking squatty keyframe that has this nice blend on the inside, that fancy outline around it. I like the way this is looking. Let me just shift this over a little bit. I think that is all aligned a little bit more nicely. And we can move on to the next step, which is adding a little bit of a stylized look to the entire cartridge. So what I want to do first is this kind of offset stroke style where you're moving the stroke, kind of misaligning it from the fill. And typically, you'd probably think of doing this with 2 copies of the same paths, one for the fill and one for the stroke, but we can actually do this a lot more efficiently. So what I want to do first is grab everything that has this yellow fill and purple outline. So just to make sure I get everything, I'm going to go to my layers panel and target all of those objects. So the first one is the outer shell. I'll shift click on this rectangle, this group, not the text, these 2 lines though. The blend for this little trench area right here, and I think that's everything. With all of those selected, I'm going to remove the fill and the stroke, but before I do that, I want to make sure that I save them somewhere. So I'm going to open up my Swatches panel, Window Swatches, and I'm going to start by actually just clearing everything out. These are just the default swatches that are included with every single file that you create inside of Illustrator, but I want to clear them all out. I'm going to click on this folder, shift click on this swatch here so everything is selected, and delete them. Yes, I want to delete them, and then I'm going to, with that selected, come up to this little menu and say New Color Group, and I'll just call this Cartridge, and make sure Selected Artwork is selected and these 2 checkboxes are unchecked. Click OK, and that's going to create swatches with what I have selected. Now this lighter purple, I don't know why it created that. I don't see how I'm using that color anywhere in my artwork, so I'm just going to drag that to the trash. But now that I have those stored, I can safely clear out the fill and the stroke and know that I can always get back to those colors. Now what I want to do is group all of these paths together because they're all styled exactly the same. So I'm just going to press Command G on the keyboard to group them together. And there we go. That's now showing up here. And I'm going to take this opportunity to just kind of label some of these objects and groups. So this first one, I'm going to double click and call Cartridge. This is helpful just to keep everything organized. I'll group these 2 objects together because that's the keyframe, and I'll call that Keyframe. And then I'm going to rename this one Dust Cover. That is turned off right now, that's why we don't see it. And then we've got the text. I'll just group those 2 together as well. Call that Text. All right, and this one is the background. So BG for background. Now, I want to take those paths, that group that is no longer styled, and I want to apply the fill and the stroke to the entire group rather than the individual paths. So let me open up my appearance panel so we can see exactly what's going on. I have my group selected. That's what we see up here at the top, not the contents. But if I just deselect one more time and grab that, I'm on the group and I can now add a fill, and a stroke is automatically applied as well. So for the fill, I want to make that the yellow color. And for the stroke, I want to make that the purple color. Make it 10 points. Make sure that it's rounded on both the cap and the corner. And we're back to what we had before. The benefit of this now is that I can offset the stroke using one of our effects across every path that makes up the cartridge, and that way I can manage it all from one place instead of having to do it to every single object. So the way that we're going to do this is make sure that our stroke is selected, not just the object, but click on the actual stroke, and then click on the Effects button, go to Distort and Transform, and back to the Transform effect. This is what's so powerful about Illustrator, is that you can apply an effect like this directly to a fill or a stroke or the entire object. It's totally up to you. But with that selected, all I have to do is tap my up arrow on the horizontal or the vertical axis, and I can offset that stroke. So it looks like 10 pixels in both directions is going to give me a decent offset. I'll click on OK, and there we go. I have this offset stroke that's based on the entire group, and I don't have to have multiple copies. You see that if I were to manipulate any one of these paths, that stroke is going to update with it, which is really, really convenient. Now, I need to reposition some of this other stuff a little bit, and some of my grouping rearranged the order of these objects, so I need to make sure that text goes back on top of the cartridge. But basically, I need to move the text group and the keyframe group over now so that it's aligned to the center of the stroke, which has been offset a little bit. So I'm going to move it over and down just a little bit. I'm just eyeballing. I'm not being too concerned with being perfect with that. but now I have this kind of cool offset stroke from the fill. Next, I want to add some stylized shading to this, and I'm going to do it in a very similar way. Another really powerful feature of the appearance panel is that you can not only have effects applied to strokes or fills, but you can have multiple strokes and fills. So if I make sure that I have my group selected, I'm looking at that group in my appearance panel, I could duplicate this stroke by dragging it down to the new icon right down here, and now I have 2 strokes. I'll grab the second one and change the color to being something, I don't know, bright green, and then increase this size. You can see, there we go, we've got a second stroke underneath that purple one. And if I wanted to, I could go into the transform effect and really shift this around so that it's just crazy. Maybe I have just a second stroke going off in a different direction. Maybe I want to keep that at 10 points and change the opacity to something like overlay. That's totally doable, and it's all being based on those original vector paths. Now, obviously that's not something I wanted to do, so I'm going to delete that. Instead, and I got to make sure that I have that group selected, then delete that stroke. Instead, what I want to do is add a second fill. So I'm going to duplicate this one, and I want to change the second one, the one on top, to be a gradient. So I'm going to make sure that's selected. I'll go over to the gradient button, and there we go. I've got my gradient panel popping up on me, and let me give myself a little bit more room to work here. But now I can modify this gradient so that it is, instead of going left to right, coming from the bottom up. And to do that, all I have to change is this right here, change it to -90 and press enter. And now I've got this dark to light, and I can rearrange the sizing of this gradient however I need to. So maybe I don't want it to be quite as big, but something like around here, bringing that shading down. But obviously I don't want this black and white gradient on its own. What I want to do is apply an effect to this fill and then blend it on top of the original color. So I'm going to come down to the effects panel, and this time I'm going to go into the Photoshop effects, which, if you remember, was raster effects, things that are being applied not to the paths, but to the actual visual representation of those paths once they've been rasterized. So I'm going to come down to the pixelate category and go to color halftone. With all of these defaults selected, I'm just going to click OK so you can see what this effect does. And I'm going to turn off the stroke so it's a little bit easier just for now. But it's basically taking that gradient and splitting it up into CMYK and making this halftone pattern, which is actually a print technique that people use in the real world. But that's not the effect that I'm going for. What I want to do is make all of these dots line up on top of each other so that they're basically just black. So what I want to do is go into that color halftone, making sure that's selected, go into my color halftone, and change the channels. These represent cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and change all of the angles to be the same number. So I'm going to just go with this first number, which is 108, and put it in all of the other channels. So 108 on all, click OK, and now they're all aligned to that 180 degrees, and I've got the black and white. From there, I'm going to change the opacity of just that fill color by clicking on that opacity, and actually I'm not going to change the opacity, I'm going to change the blend mode that's just under the opacity panel to multiply. That's going to blend out all of the white. We can see through now to the background yellow color and turn that stroke back on. So now I've got this halftone shading in the background. It's not very pretty yet, but it is there. What I can do is go into that color halftone and change the radius down to, say, 6 to make all of those dots a little bit finer. And then another thing that will change the way that this looks is my gradient. So with that selected, I pressed G to get to the gradient, and I can manipulate this a little bit further. So let me bring this point up and then change this color, instead of being pure black, to just being a lighter color. And that will make the dots a lot smaller, because that's just how halftones work. The darkest areas have bigger dots, the lighter areas have smaller dots. So we can very interactively change the way that this looks just by manipulating the gradient, which is really helpful. But let's say that I actually want some color in there. Well, instead of just leaving it black and white, I'm going to select that color, go to this little menu and make sure that I'm on hue, saturation, and brightness. And that will give me sliders that allow me to introduce some saturation, maybe turn up the brightness. Actually, if you want solid color, you pretty much need to turn the brightness all the way up, and then you can kind of use the saturation as a way to control the width of the dots. So something like that, and I'll shift this over to being more of an orangey color. Maybe increase that a little bit so we see some more of those dots. But this is a great time to preview the pixel preview. So I'm going to go up to View, Pixel Preview, and see what that looks like. I think that's looking great. Those dots are looking really nice. It's a subtle effect. I don't want it to be overbearing, but just gives it a little bit of a texture to the bottom of the cartridge right there. And I'll turn my pixel preview back off. All right, so that's a really powerful use of the appearance panel. We're also going to apply this to the dust cover. So let me grab that, enable that, and bring it back to the top, and then do a very similar thing to the actual container. So I'm going to make sure that I only select that shape, and I'm going to add a second fill. Bring that right above the dark color, and then change this to a gradient. And it's going to remember the settings that we had before. So I need to change this to not having any color at all. I'm just going to take the saturation all the way out, turn the brightness down so that it's something like this. And then this time, instead of doing a halftone effect, I'm going to use a grain to make a grainy looking gradient. So I'm going to go to my effects, down to texture, and then grain. And if you're familiar with the Photoshop filter gallery, this is pretty much identical to what you get in there. I want to manipulate some of these settings. I'm going to change my grain type from regular to stippled. That's going to give me this nice little pointy, crispy, crunchy looking grain. Maybe turn this contrast down and the intensity down as well. Somewhere around there. Click OK. And then again, change the opacity of that fill to being multiply. Because this background object isn't colored, I'm not worried about the color, so I'm just going to leave it at multiply. I'm not going to change the colors. I just want to manipulate the actual darkness of that black. So it can get pretty dark down here and then feather out up here. I can also change the direction of this gradient. If I just click and drag, I can freeform draw this out, and it looks like I need to go in the opposite direction. But something like, I don't know, maybe this. Produces a nice grainy gradient. It's a little bit hard to see, but just like the halftone, I don't want it to be, like overpowering. I don't want it to be an eyesore. Just some subtle texture there is all I need. Maybe make it just a little bigger. I'm gonna grab this point, drag it down a little. That way we can see that texture nice and clear pretty much all the way across that dust cover. Now I can see that offset stroke peeking out behind that dust cover, so I'm going to just select the dust cover, make sure that it's aligned to the center of my document. It looks like I'm going to need to bring up my align panel to do this, so let me just close some of these that I'm not using right now, and then bring up my window align panel, and then just make sure that align to artboard is selected and center it on the horizontal and vertical axes. There we go. Now that's centered up, and I can reposition the cartridge based on that positioning. So I'm going to select everything else, drag it up and over a little bit so that it sits right behind that dust cover and we don't see any of that offset stroke peeking out behind it. Very nice. And with that, my artwork is complete and it is ready to bring into After Effects. Now, there are 1,000,001 ways to bring artwork from Illustrator in After Effects. I'm not going to cover all of them right now. I'm actually going to use a technique that you probably don't use all that often, which is basically just treating this artwork as layers inside of After Effects, as rasterized graphics, no shape layers necessary because most of this stuff that I've done actually won't translate into shape layers. I could recreate a lot of this effect inside of After Effects, but I have no need to. I don't need this artwork to be shape layers. All I need is the dust cover and everything else. 2 layers. I don't need to manipulate the halftones. I don't need to manipulate the shading on the cartridge or on the dust cover. It's all fine the way it is. I don't need access to anything else. So what I want to do is just separate each object into its own layer, because that is important when bringing layers from an Illustrator file into After Effects. It doesn't look at the individual objects, it looks at layers and merges everything in them. So to break everything up into their own layers, I'm first going to group the entire cartridge, text, and keyframe, group that together, and then select the entire layer, target that layer, come up to this menu, and say Release to Layers Sequence. That's going to convert all of those groups into their own layers, but they're still sublayers within the main layer. So I need to grab all 3 of these, drag them out, and now I have 4 layers. So I can get rid of that original one. It is empty now. I'll rename this one BG for background, this one cartridge, and this one dust cover. And now I have those 3 individual layers that will come up as individual layers inside of After Effects, and I can animate them. So let's jump into After Effects real quick. I need to bring in my artwork, so I'm going to right click, go to Import and File, and then grab that cartridge artwork on my desktop, click on open, and make sure that I'm importing it as a composition with the footage dimensions being the layer size. Click on OK, and there we go, I've got my composition. I want to first make sure that I have the right frame rate. I do not, so Command K to get into my composition settings. Change that to 24 frames per second and click OK. And just like that, I have my background layer, I have my cartridge, and I have my dust cover, and I can animate this. I'm not gonna do anything too complicated here, just a very basic animation of the cartridge coming out of the dust sleeve and the dust sleeve going down to the bottom. So let's jump forward maybe 12 frames, shift page down to go 10, page down twice to go 2 more, and now I'm on frame 12. And I'll start there. So I'll select both the dust cover and the cartridge, Option P to set position keyframes, and then go forward maybe 1 second. And I'm going to move the cartridge cover all the way down off the screen, and I'm gonna move this one up just a little bit. Now this looks a little bit funny just because of the resolution of my screen, and I'm fitting it. But this is nice and crisp and clear if I zoom into 100%. So I'm just gonna zoom to fit. Just don't mind that low resolution quality. All right, with those, I'm going to select both keyframes, ease them, and then go into my graph editor and probably change this to my speed graph. And then I'm just gonna manipulate these handles a little bit so it's a nice eased bell curve. All right, and that might be a little bit slow, so let me bring this over. Not bad. Now I just want to offset them a little bit in time so that the sleeve starts, and actually I did that backwards, so I want the cartridge to start moving after the dust sleeve. So there we go, the dust sleeve goes down, and then the cartridge comes up, and then right about here, I want it to go back on. So I'm gonna select this keyframe, set, copy and paste it, and then offset them again 3 frames. It looks like, was that 1, 2, 3 frames? Yes, so they're gonna come back, and I need to time reverse these keyframes. Right click, time reverse so that it swaps those pairs of keyframes and it comes back to where it started. So right about there, I'll set my work area and preview that. So it comes out and it goes back in. And then it loops. Okay, great. Next, I want to bring kind of a shimmer, a light shine on this cartridge just for a little bit of an effect right here. To do that, I'm going to add a light sweep effect. And this is Effects Console from Video Copilot. If you haven't used it, you don't know what you're looking at, that's what I'm using. But I'm just going to apply a light sweep here, and I'm going to manipulate this a little bit. So I want to make it nice and bright. Sharp is fine. The width can be nice and thick, and the edge intensity can be down. Edge thickness can be gone. But I'm gonna change this angle a little bit, and then change the color to be based on this yellow. Maybe make it a little bit more orange. Nice and saturated. Something like that. And that's gonna give me a really quick and easy way to make this light sweep, the shimmer that I want. So I'm gonna start with it off to the side, add a keyframe on the center, and then move forward maybe, I don't know, 4 frames, maybe 5, and shift that over to the right side. So it goes real fast, and let's just see what that looks like. Pops out, okay, maybe 1 more frame. Looks good. I'm just gonna make the intensity a little bit bigger or greater so that it just shines a little bit more. And then what I wanna do is duplicate that effect, make it a little bit smaller, change that width down, and then offset it a little bit. So I'm gonna press U to bring up that keyframe and send it forward 1 frame. And now I've kind of got this double shimmer. I think that looks pretty good. And then I just wanna repeat that. I want it to happen twice. So I'm going to copy and paste these keyframes, offset them by 1 frame again, and then probably just butt them right up against that second pair so that it just loops around itself twice very quickly. And I'd really like this second one to be a little bit closer to the original. So I'm just gonna zoom in here, grab these keyframes, go to my graph editor, make sure they are selected, and then make sure that allow keyframes between frames is selected. And then I can shift this around more freely. I'll just tighten those 2 up a little bit. There we go. Let's preview that again. Pops out, shimmer, shimmer, goes back in, loops. There we go. Just like that, I've got my looping animation with this stylized artwork that was very customized inside of Illustrator. Illustrator doesn't have to be frustrating for motion designers. It was for me at one point, but once I sat down and really dug in and learned the software, I realized all of the tools that it has available that After Effects just doesn't. I love working with vector paths in Illustrator more than any other program. So I hope that this video gave you a little bit of insight into what it's like creating artwork inside of Illustrator that you can then bring into After Effects and animate. If you'd like to learn more about making things inside of Illustrator and in Photoshop, check out my course, Photoshop and Illustrator Unleashed, right here on School of Motion, where I dive deep into both of these pieces of software with motion design specifically in mind for the complete beginner or somebody who's been doing motion design and just hasn't been using these two programs to their full potential. It's a 4-week course where we dive deep into both Photoshop and Illustrator so you can get up and running and using these two programs to your advantage in your motion design projects. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching.